Thank you, and welcome to today's session. Let me begin by, first of all, of course, welcoming my panel here. I have to my right, Adama Mariko, Secretary General of the FIX Financing Common Summit and Agence Française de Développement. To his right, Dr. Pooja Sawani, Global Director for Climate Change for Habitat for Humanity International. And then Karel Cronenberg, Senior Technical Advisor for Climate Change of the Council of Europe Development Bank. And myself is Thomas Eriksson, also Council of Europe Development Bank, where I'm the Director for our technical sectors. First of all, let me start by saying that the session will run in the following way. I will open up with some introductory thoughts, and I will then give a few questions to the panel that they will answer, and we can take it from there. So let me begin by painting a quick picture of the current situation. As our global population swells, industrialization advances, and so does our appetite for energy. Fossil fuels, the traditional backbone of our energy systems, have fueled our progress, but to a significant cost, as we all know too well. Environmental degradation, climate change, the very reasons we are here at this summit. And in the face of these challenges, energy efficiency emerges as an important pathway towards a sustainable and resilient future. Let me bring in the concept of energy poverty briefly. Energy poverty, the inability of households to meet their energy needs to a degree that it negatively impacts their well-being and ability to prosper. It's a global challenge. It disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable. The results are, for example, periods of power outages, households unable to adequately heat, cool, cook, clean, or provide light in their households at affordable prices. Clearly, the effects of the energy poverty are multiple, and it negatively affects socioeconomic development. Children struggle to study, health suffer, businesses falter. The causes of energy poverty are multiple, of course, but to simplify and looking at the household level, there are four most common ones. One is about access to reliable energy. The second, low income. Third, poor energy efficiency of energy, so what we talk about today, of course. And fourthly, high energy pricing. Clearly, these are very linked. For example, residents of energy-efficient homes need to spend more energy, hence spend the higher share of their disposable income to maintain a healthy living environment. On top of this, poorer residents often have limited options to do something about their energy poverty and energy efficiency situation of their home. They typically rent, or they can only afford low-quality housing. At the same time, we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the knowledge to make a meaningful impact. Governments, businesses, financiers, individuals all have a role to play. In conclusion, the importance of energy efficiency cannot be overstated. It's a catalyst for sustainable economic growth, for societal development, and for individual well-being, and of course, key to tackle climate change. Let me now move on to the panel to dive deeper into these questions. I will ask two questions to each panel member and very much welcome their insights, thoughts, experiences, and examples. Let me start with you, Adama. So you represent both the French Development Agency, AFD, and the FIX Financing Common initiative, which brings together all the public development banks. How do you see their role in tackling energy poverty? And from a partnership perspective, how do you see the traction with respect to national development banks and their role?
No, thank you, Thomas. I think this is an important discussion, as public development banks often intervene in developed areas, but also in developing countries. And in developing countries, mainly the trouble is access to energy. That amplify the energy poverty sentiment, because people don't even have access to energy itself. And when they are, obviously the problematics we are seeing is the affordability of the energy itself, whether because the people that are involved don't have enough income to access the energy, or the energy consumption they have is not the optimum one at a point that it hurts their living conditions. And we think that this is also something is creating complex problematic in a developing area where people also need energy to keep growing and have a better living conditions. So even in Europe, you mentioned it earlier, you have between 30 and 50 million people that have energy poverty hurt by them. So we have two conditions to solve that, and while also public development banks used to look at that. One is how to help to upgrade the income from the people, and the other one is how do we look at a way to raise energy efficiency so the consumption of energy they have is the optimum one at an affordable cost. So often governments used to work on the first side of it by either regulating the cost, the price, or giving subsidies to people, or paying direct bills, etc., etc. So helping those who are suffering from energy poverty to have more income and going inside it. But I think the challenging part is how do we also look at the way to have the optimum consumption of energy at a lower production cost, etc., etc., and in a sustainable way as well. So that's where I think the public development banks are more involved. As you said, I'm also working with IFD. I am Deputy Executive Director from Partnership is in IFD, but what we see is that public development banks mainly, whether they are in the northern part or the southern part of the globe, they help governments and populations in many ways by de-risking the investments, reducing the investments that are needed to create sufficient energy supply, by also being involved in a policy discussion or policy regulation, policy influence in this system, by also developing cooperation between banks, and I will develop on that later. And I think all those aspects, besides bringing concessional also investment directly in those operations to give affordable energy. So on the first one, I think the public development banks are main players in the system, to bring energy at larger scale in a sustainable way, where they can use their balance sheet to help governments where we see there's fiscal surface really narrowing in leveraging the concessional way that public development banks can invest, catalyze finances, bring guarantees in operation, and to give opportunity to private sector to invest in energy production in an affordable cost. I think that's a way public development bank play and should keep doing. In a regulation side, of course, I think it's also important to have these national discussions around the priorities we see there. And I think one of the policy recommendations we should also see public development banks pushing is mainly to help communities and people in investing on energy efficiency for households, because in a way it's where also we see this stuff, right? So if you look at the European area, you would have some governments helping on when you reduce your energy consumption, you have incentives for that. So those policies are not really seen in the developing areas, but also pushing policies that that came, bring incentive also in accessing affordable clean energy, by making solar investment, even in some villages, etc., etc. It's very useful to also develop those kind of policies. And yeah, probably in a corporation side, you were talking about partnership. I think there's also where public development banks can have a leading role, as banks know how to cooperate, and public development banks specifically. And I think there is where also we should pushing. That's why we create this finance in common movement, which gathers, as you say, 530 public development banks in the world. 90% of those 500 banks work on their national ground, so play a role in their national economy. And I think the partnership level we are bringing here is also to just share methodologies on how we finance energy, how we develop projects on energy consumption reductions, how we develop projects on energy efficiency, how we also involve a private sector in those investments. And it is useful to share those data, those knowledge, to share the business models we are having to finance those priorities in a way that we support collectively the energy transition and the just transition that goes with it, because the just part also is to have a social equality, which also is part of the energy poverty problem.
Thank you so much, Adam. I heard some very good points. I will come back to them at the end.
Sure.
And try to bring it together at that stage. If I may move to Puja, Habitat for Humanity. Why is it particularly important to focus in on vulnerable groups in your mind? And how do you do it? How do you address vulnerable groups? How do you bring them in? And what are some of the examples and lessons that you have learned through your work?
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to first and foremost join this very interesting discussion. I appreciate that a lot. And Thomas, you already touched a little bit upon why we need to look at vulnerable communities. So through the work that Habitat for Humanity does, really, we've increasingly realized by working in different regions, and we do work across the globe in about 70 countries, on various issues and topics, including on energy efficiency, especially with the low-income households, and also the vulnerable communities. So as we see the energy transition, and as we also hear more and more about climate change and, being more energy efficient in the process, we feel, and through the work that we've done, we realize it's leaving a very important and a very large portion of population, which is vulnerable to, the fluxes in the energy, whether we are talking in terms of the high energy prices, but these are very low-income communities that we are working with, and we realize that, these have a direct impact and are, in fact, increasing the disparity in the access of these households to even very basic services and amenities. It has an overall impact on the economy of the low-income households, as well as things like the education level and the health of the people, and also where they stand in society. And, people don't really think about the interconnectedness of all these issues, but we've realized through the work that we've done, and we see that increasingly in the countries, as I said, that we work with. And here I would like to take the example of the work that we are doing in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and also in some of the former Soviet states. There's a project that we're working on, it's called RELI, which is the residential energy efficiency for low-income households, and covers countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Armenia, and Macedonia. And another project which is called the Community Tailored Action for Energy Poverty Mitigation. So we started with the RELI project about 10 to 12 years ago, and it was funded by USAID. But then, based on the lessons learned from that, in fact, we've had 2 rounds of projects which have been funded by the EU in other Eastern European countries, because it realizes the importance of addressing the issue of energy poverty. And these are particularly looking at low-income households who are living in these sort of, the Soviet era housing, old buildings which are very energy inefficient. So what we are doing is we are working with the low-income households, with those communities, with the residential associations that are there, but also with the government and the private sector to come together really to, to work on making these buildings more energy efficient. And it's really showing a lot of impact already on the ground. And it's also helped, raise some of the social parameters that we are talking about in terms of health, in terms of better quality of life, in terms of a sense of security that it provides to the people. And we've also, in the process, Adama, you just mentioned about partnerships. So Habitat for Humanity, we have what we call a P4 framework, which is people-public-private partnership, with an emphasis on involving the people at the same level as we involve the government, as well as the private sector, and bring them all together really to talk about how best to not only invest, but also how best to work together to tackle this issue of energy poverty. So thank you, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Pooja. Let me go to Carol. What is the role of the public sector in all of this? And what are some of the main barriers for tackling energy efficiency, especially when you look at the phase of renovating the housing stock that already exists?
Yeah, it's an important question. Let me come a little bit back on first, who is the CEB? We are a bank with a specific social mandate. So we focus on, if we talk about housing and we talk about energy efficiency, our focus is also on the vulnerable groups and very much on the affordable housing sector. And what we see in Europe at the moment is that we're lagging behind in renovation rates. At the moment, the renovation rate in Europe is only 1% per year. And in order to achieve our objectives and our decarbonization objectives, and basically also the implementation of the Paris Accord by the European Union, we need to have at least a rate, and you can calculate it on the back of an envelope of 2 or 3% or even more. What we see so far is that there are many barriers, and one of the barriers is basically how to make sure that the most vulnerable groups are basically not left behind, because it are specifically those groups that are living in the, I would say, in the least well performing buildings, and this is actually where the public sector should step in and could step in. And there are multiple ways of the public sector stepping in. One of the ways stepping in is basically looking at legislation. And taking one example, we, as a CEB, also invest a lot in Eastern Europe. And specifically, if you look at that situation of home ownership, then most of the houses are actually owned by people. During the period of privatization, houses, apartment buildings, multiple apartment buildings were basically given for very, I would say, low prices to the owners, but they have not been able to make, I would say, the necessary investments in the last 20 years in making those houses more energy efficient. And their public sector could step in. First of all, in basically making it possible for the people to do the necessary investments. Currently, we see that more and more, and a significant part of incomes are getting into energy cost. We see even energy costs, I would say, exceeding the cost of the rents, even significantly. Secondly, we see that governments are basically heavily subsidizing energy at the moment. So we can basically state it as energy subsidies. And tens of or even hundreds of billions have been invested or have been basically spent by governments into energy costs. So they're basically already playing an important role there. And what do you think, how can we make it that these investments are not done in subsidizing basically fossil fuels, but into actually improving households. And that's where I would say clever grant schemes come in. So not just schemes where people can ascribe in and where basically often the most vulnerable or the most low income classes are not benefiting from. But secondly, also in legislation. And then I come back to our experience in working in multiple apartment buildings. That in some countries, and I'm quite active, for instance, also in Serbia, you see that the legislation is quite, I would say, restrictive for the renovation of multi-apartment buildings. If you look at the owners, housing associations, then basically they are not really a party in receiving subsidies. They don't have access to finance by banks. And also, it's almost impossible to do, I would say, a complete overhaul of a building when some people in the building, for whatever reasons, are not willing to tip in or to contribute. It could be an elderly person of 80 years old. Why does she want to have a deep renovation in her house? Also because, well, she will not benefit from those renovations in the same way that a young family will benefit from that. And that was really something that I would say legislation changes, like we have also, for instance, seen in the Slovak Republic, will have a very positive benefit. More on a higher level, and that is the last point I want to make, is that, of course, at the level of the EU, a lot of discussion is going on as well. We are basically in a very important period now with the revision of the Energy Performance Building Directive, and that is currently being reviewed. There are lots of discussions going on. The latest, I would say, voting in Parliament will be, I thought, on the 7th of December, so it's very close to now. Unfortunately, things have been watered down, and that is really a pity, because I was just mentioning that energy efficiency investments are very important. These investments can lead to, I would say, significant cost savings for society. They basically pay back. You should not even see them as costs. They're basically benefits for society. And even then, you see that there are, I would say, restrictions or holding back, and maybe I can come back to that later, that these things are not happening at the moment. And of course, an organization like CEB does see those restrictions. We try to play our part, but we are part of a bigger puzzle, and that puzzle needs to be solved.
Thank you, Karen. Thank to all the panelists. You know what I can do now? Let me maybe take a step back and try to pull together some of these thoughts, and I give maybe the panel the floor back again to see if you want to add anything to that. And we can also check in with the floor if someone wants to ask any questions there. But what I hear from all of you, and you're sort of coming at the same issue from different perspectives. I hear that everyone has a role to play. That's clear. There's a big role for the financing from the financing side, PDBs. National development banks, national financiers, to find ways to both finance, of course, the energy supply system, but also help de-risk and bring in all the actors that can help bring this and bridge this investment gap in the sector. Clearly, there is also a big role of government, and I will come back to that role later on as well, but just to here, kind of put that placeholder. But I also hear there is a lot of need to bring in and focus on engaging at the local level throughout the whole chain and make sure that you bring in actors that are typically possibly otherwise not engaged, the housing associations. And of course, that's a challenge. There is a big, there are many, of course, at that level, and there are few at the top level. So you have to find a way, of course, to structure this and bring it all together. So it's clear that it's very important to look at partnerships and bring everyone together on the same page. The second thing I think I hear from all of you as well, it's clear that we need to focus on those who are at risk of being further vulnerable as a result. We all say the same thing here, I think, from different perspective again. Energy poverty is is very real. We hear it from the European perspective, but you also hear it from any other lens we look at from any other region. And it's an issue where households spend more and more of their disposable income on energy at a level where it impacts well-being and impacts the ability to look after and make sure that the development of your family and of your children and so on is in the right way. So it's very important, I think, of course, here to focus on the vulnerable groups. And the last thing I heard as well from the panel in many ways is that we have to bring a focus on the legislation and the regulations around this. Make sure it enables both all the actors to play their role, but also to look at what are some of the smart incentives and other ways we can bring in to make these kind of investments in energy efficiency a reality at all levels. These were in a way my three main areas of key takeaway points that I heard from you all. But let me give the floor back to you quickly to see if you want to add anything, and then we can open up to the floor if anything from there as well. Can we go the same order, Adama, Pooja, Karel?
Sure. No, thank you very much. And of course, I think the regulation part is important. Whether it is to keep supporting the income side of the households, but I think the regulation should also push more on how we develop, the second group of measures, which is energy efficiency improvement, the heating system, heating or cooling somehow, because we used to say the heating system because we came from Europe, but saying it in Dubai is quite problematic in my ears right now. But implementing also low-cost energy efficiency measures, including the advice we are giving to people and also to the companies somehow. But I just probably want to refer on some examples of investments we have seen recently. Actually, it's in the southern part of Europe, as you're mentioning in AFD. I've seen also some of those in Albania, working to define a national action plan on energy poverty. And I think this is also a scale-up level where the government can push public policy discussions with banks in order to also have them involved in financing this kind of reform. Also in Moldova, we have been involved in projects to align the energy sector with the EU norms, and ambitious reforms have been taken by the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection on consumers' protections while we open the sector to competition. It's also important to be careful on how the private competitors now selling the energy to people should also avoid risking more vulnerability on people, etc., etc. In Georgia as well, some cooperation with other European institutions, with GIZ, to improve energy efficiency of buildings. And probably the last I would announce is the project where we mobilize capital from the GCF. And I think that's also to illustrate how the public development banks can be leveraging concessional money in the vertical funds, where GCF is acting for climate. We also succeeded in mobilizing GCF to launch a program involving 11 countries, including Albania, Northern Macedonia. And in this project, the benefits that comes from the concessional grants and loan has been invested to develop technical assistance, for the countries, and also for the private sector investing on public or private buildings to raise the energy efficiency. These resources has been mixed with AFD loans to enable projects worth 1.3 billion to be financed over 5 years. And I think that's also an example that we can show how public development banks can leverage their balance sheet in blending concessional resources from vertical funds. I'm going to stop there.
No, thank you, Adama. Very good examples. And it's also good to hear that you brought out both to look at the supply side and demand side of the equation. And I think the other point that you made here, that you also need to think of making sure that in the discussions on reforms and regulations that you bring in the whole chain, also the private actors, to make sure that you capture and don't risk further vulnerabilities as a result, right? So, and also good examples on concessional finance. I think it's good to hear as well. I think that's clearly a role that we, and as a multilateral development bank and public development banks, can play to leverage the financing further. Pooja, any additional comments from your side?
Yes, I just wanted to add that, you know, the projects that I just mentioned in Central and Eastern Europe that we are working on, really they are also focusing on developing a regional effort. So it's not that we're just looking at, you know, a few countries, but we're really looking at sort of leveraging that, making this, you know, level more regional, and also by forging new partnerships, as I'd mentioned, about the P4 framework, to address the impacts of the rising energy prices on collective housing specifically. You'd mentioned that a little bit, Carl. And really the ultimate aim that we're looking to do is to implement projects that would actually help uplift these low-income communities out of the energy poverty. And that's what we are aiming to do in the long term. We will continue to do that. It's not an easy process. In fact, when we had started out with the Relive project, that was one of the first projects that we had done. It was really difficult to convince the people. As you've mentioned, there are different kind of people who are living in the same building. It's an old grandma who's like 80 years old compared to a very young family. So why would they invest? So it took a lot of sort of concerted effort over a couple of years. So it wasn't overnight. It wasn't a couple of months. It really was a couple of years for us to make that effort. But we did bring them on board. And as I mentioned, so we have this sort of a model that's worked in those countries, and now we are replicating it to other Eastern European countries, but also in other regions that we work with. So it does work. It takes collective effort and also collective action. And we have to be very clear to all the stakeholders that are involved. We have to very clearly state what's in it for them, because that really is the bottom line for everyone who's involved in the project, whether it's the public sector, whether it's the private sector, or the communities that we are working with. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Very good, and very good examples, and interesting to hear. And I think this is what this is about, right? I mean, we come together, we share experiences, and we bring out the models that we have found that works in a certain context, and try to see how we can replicate them. So it's really good to hear what you have done. And I think you brought a very good point. I mean, there is a regional lens to this as well. Housing markets and the challenges, of course, have been developed in a certain context. And that is clearly, you have to tackle it in that context. And I think the final point that you made is really important. We have to find a value for everyone involved. So what's in it for me, for you, for everyone else, throughout the whole chain. But Kara, let me come to you as well to see if you have any additional points.
I want a slight step back. We are currently in the joint NDB pavilion, and yesterday we had a very interesting discussion in this joint pavilion on country platforms. Country platforms is basically just an idea of, I would say, we need improved coordination and collaboration. And I would say that goes beyond MDBs. That goes also, it's also coordination in countries themselves, but also coordination with other organizations like Habitat for Humanity, for instance. So it would be interesting to bring in those organizations also in those country platform approaches. And actually we're going to, I would say, announce one of the platforms tomorrow on North Macedonia, exactly in that same region. It's an energy sector focused platform, but on the other hand, for the CEB, it's very much also on the element of just transition that is important. But also, we should also realize that the housing sector and the building sector are, I would say, an enormous, I would say, the most significant consumer of energy in Europe and in a lot of regions anyway. So it's very important to have that focus. There's one other thing I would like to mention, also talking about, I would say, regional focus. We just completed a 12-year program. It's called the Regional Housing Program. where we basically renovated and built up to almost 12,000 houses with 300 million of investment from CEB side. And that is a great example, because it was also working together with the EU, working together with other MDBs, working together with local countries, achieving those elements. But we also have some, I would say, some lessons learned, and I want to finish with that. We will publish during this COP an evaluation report produced by the CEB, specifically on what did we learn from energy efficiency projects in the housing sector. And there are two things that I would like to highlight. First, it's a role also of post-monitoring. We sometimes forget that. We basically very much, I would say, looking up front and generating enough finance to, but actually to understand what are successful projects, why are they successful, and what do they achieve, and not only in terms of energy, but also in terms of, I would say, social outcomes. We sometimes forget that. It's very important. And the second thing is very much about the role of grants. We need to be more clever about that. It's not about throwing finance to certain groups. It's very much to do that in a very clever way, because the enormous renovation wave that we needs also involvement of the private sector. So how can we make, I would say, investment in, I would say, social housing, in energy efficiency improvements for vulnerable groups attractive for banks, and that's where the grant money could be used in probably a better way. And it's really working together with local public and private banks to achieve those objectives. And I would say using in a better way grant money is also one of the conclusions in the evaluation report.
Thank you, Karel. Further good lessons, I think, here. Of course, I think the first one you said is, housing sector is an important sector. Let's keep that in mind, right? I mean, it's one of the biggest consumers of energy in any region, in Europe particularly. Mm-hmm. I think the second point you mentioned as well, and I think these are some of the really good lessons that comes out of the practical experience of the Council of Europe Development Bank then. Also look at monitoring. I mean, what works actually over time, rather than only at the ex-ante stage, or rather than only before, right? So, and use that to learn lessons, what actually works over time as well. So come back again a few years later and monitor the situation and learn and see from there which project actually had the biggest impact. Mm-hmm. And I think the last point, and I think there's something Adama also mentioned a lot of, use of grants, use of concessional finance, use of technical assistance. Find the places where they make the most impact, where they can create incentives, where they can create leverage. And blending is one solution, but also bringing in the private actors in that as well. Before I wrap up, I wanted to see if there's anything from the audience. Anyone have a question or comment? Yeah, we have one here and two there. Do you have a microphone that we can help? Or we get one from behind you there, so.
Jessica from the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. We're a policy network alliance of over 85 central banks from around 82 emerging markets around the world. So one of our most important work streams is around inclusive green finance. And so would just love to learn more about the role of the private sector and how we can make banking more sustainable in terms of lending in green finance. How can we bring the private sector more into this? So would love to hear from you.
Let's take the two questions and then we come back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Seth Owusumante. I'm a research fellow from the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University in the US. So, I came in later, so pardon me if you already touched on this, but in your attempt to implement energy efficiency projects or address energy poverty, what has been the single most important difficulty or challenge that you face? And how do we crack that up to be able to address energy poverty at scale? Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more there. Go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is also Chanda, Director of Water and Sanitation at the African Development Bank. My question is related to regulations, services, utility regulations. How can we support and make regulators to address more of the vulnerable and also in ensuring that there's consistency in the tariff setting so that the vulnerable particularly are addressed. How can we support the regulators to do that? Thank you.
Thank you. Three great questions. Anyone wants to pick any particular question? I think the middle question, or on you know, what is the main challenge and how do we crack that challenge? Let's close with that, maybe from each of you. But maybe we take the first and the last question first before we go to that question. So the first question on private sector and green finance. I don't know, Carol, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start.
And then we can pass it along if someone wants to add to that.
Yeah, of course, this is an important. CB, we are a private sector focused bank, but that doesn't mean that we're a public sector focused bank. But it doesn't mean that the private sector isn't important for us. On the contrary, but what is very important is the role of local banks, and for us, a successful model to involve the private sector is basically to develop programs together with local banks. And that could be microfinance credit lines, but also one of the cooperations that we have on energy efficiency is with the Bulgarian Development Bank, where we basically, I would say, are sitting together thinking how can we design it in such a way that the credit lines and the products that the Bulgarian Development Bank is developing, that they address our targets and our objectives, and that is of course an important model. Of course, you need a holistic view, so it's often I would say the public sector or the governments that play an important role in setting the context and setting the regulation, and it was already being mentioned, but it is super important because otherwise it doesn't come automatically, and of course in the private sector you need to create the right incentives for the right groups, and that is then we already come to the challenges, but I will address that later. Thank you.
Anything to add to Carol's on the private sector and green finance?
Just wanted to add, I mean, Habitat for Humanity really is an organization that is working at the grassroots with really low-income people and communities. And these communities really, many of them are not even eligible for a loan from banks. You know, they're way below the level where the banks would give them fund. But we as an organization really also act as a guarantor in many cases. For people to get that loan, and we work with the MFIs, and we've come up with models, you know, which are very, you know, in some cases applicable only in that particular context. You know, the arrangements that we have with the bank. So the local conditions also make a big difference. So in the case of India, also we have colleagues who are dedicated to working on financing for housing. And we've seen that, you know, the arrangements that we have, for example, in India as compared to some of the countries in Africa are very different because the banks also operate very differently. The understanding is very different. So there are very sort of local models also that have been developed, which in that particular context really work well, but might not work, you know, in a different region. So we also have to be very conscious of the context that we are working in. And sometimes that, just leading up to your question, is also a challenge in itself. So, you know, the one model fits all doesn't really work because things just on the ground are very different. And we are working with very, very different circumstances. And to answer your question, sir, I'm not a banker, but I feel that even whichever sector you're working in with the, you know, in the energy efficiency space or in the housing space, there has to be capacity building. You know, as I said when I was, you know, in the initial intervention, that we have to understand what's in it for us. So it's the same for the government. Their understanding also has to be continuously updated. So it's not like you just make a case for the government at one go and expect them or the banks to understand, because the situation on the ground changes continuously. So there also has to be sort of a channel of information flow which will also enable then to put the right regulations and policies in place, which will help the low-income households. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Adam, anything on that question?
No, I think it's in. I mean, the three questions are
They're
very
linked,
important,
exactly.
and there is some intersections. We can check on that. I think, first of all, is while we're speaking about the energy, somehow we can think of the electricity access, but I think in developing countries and mostly in Africa, sometimes it's just energy to cook. Like, how do you use, energy for your living needs, and to be in a way that you can still develop the country in a sustainable way. And I think there is the three challenges that you have in the same spot, right? So the affordability of the energy itself, it means to also have clarity on what kind of energy we can still use in 2023 until the world ends, to also help developing areas to still raise and have economic growth, but still contribute in a way to the sustainability track and the SDGs. And that's the tricky part, because affordability of energy for some of the countries in Africa, for example, have discovered gas. So how do you discuss the access of this fossil energy, which is gas, that can be used also in a way to reduce energy poverty in some countries, and still be in a way that you are in a sustainability track from those countries. That's why this discussion around JETP is very important at the global level. But if we dig more in the problematics that have been raised here, so you would have also a problematic where we have regulation that are stopping development of clean energy in some areas of Africa where you have villages that are not connected with the energy supply. So if you have regulations preventing on having smart grids or some investment that are very disconnected to the but if you don't have sufficient business model for those kind of investment, or just access to energy where people can move from batteries to solar plants in the area, how do you incentivize that to have investments that can be in some local communities where you don't have enough in any state there, or the municipality that are organized, et cetera, to favorize the investment. So there's also problematics there where you have the public will from the government to also have regulation that can bring investment from private sector, for example, or just sometimes communities organizing themselves to also have the energy they need for their own needs in the area. And I think those are systemic problems we are facing in developing areas, and it needs reforms that also are localized. So in a regulation part, I'm not even thinking it from banking or financial regulation. I'm thinking it just in energy regulation in the country. How do you manage that problem? So that's where, as bankers, we also have this mandate where we have seen it in different countries and that we can give advice. But I think it's also really important that the technical assistance that we are speaking about can be used in that way also to help governments just to make sequence on, okay, this is my capital. I know that, okay, you have regulation that will prevent competition on the transportation of the energy, but the competition you are bringing on production or delivery, it has to be very clear for private sector to get involved in that. And while you are not connecting in the system, how you bring clear regulation for private sector also to invest, or just public initiative to invest in those areas. So this is a challenge we are still facing in a banking system, but I think it's also ongoing discussions with states Right. So hopefully I've touched all your problems.
No, but you did bridge the gap between the private and the regulation side as well.
Yeah,
Should we?
I think.
I'm also mindful of time because I know some of the panelists have to go to another event here. But maybe, if you don't mind, Pujak, do you want to comment as well on the regulation side? Because there was some particular question on how do you actually address vulnerability on the regulatory side. Do you have any insights there that you want to share? And maybe Carol as well on that question.
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's really, we've learned through the work that we do, it's a continuous process of talking to the different stakeholders who are involved, the key stakeholders that we are working with, whether it's the government, whether it's the communities, or whether it's the private sector. It's a long process, we realize it, but really one needs to make a case for it and also that's also what we do. You know, we do influence policy and we do talk to the governments. It's a continuous ongoing process because information changes day to day. So it's really important to keep them up to speed and to continuously make a case, for why it is important to address the issue. So, thank you.
I can't agree more with that. Actually, making the case is so important, and the case should be made clear. But we sometimes are afraid to make the case. We are so afraid to have, I would say, very targeted legislation, very targeted grants for specific groups. You always see that things are being watered down, becoming less effective. It's also one of the major challenges I see, that we need to dare to make financial flows, to make grants, because it's not a cost. It is an investment, because in the end, the overall, I would say, societal benefits are immense, especially when you talk about energy efficiency measures in the housing sector. They just pay back for society. So making that case is very important, and that will also then help, if you talk about regulation, to steer regulation into that direction as well.
Thank you so much. Maybe then to do some famous last words for each of you, because there was a question that was sort of a famous last word type question. What is the one challenge, and how do you crack that one challenge? If we start from Carol and go this way.
Yeah, I'm going to mention one challenge that I haven't mentioned at all up till now, but that is typically a European challenge, and that is lack of skilled workers and lack of skills. Because this renovation wave that we need really requires, I would say, a lot of people that are able to work on it, and I see that as a challenge that in Europe, in the housing sector, we need to tackle.
For me, I would say, considering the work that we do, it's how do we address, on one hand, the housing deficit challenge in itself, and then within that, how do we address also the energy poverty issue? So the gap is huge. We know there'll be more than like 1.2 billion people who would be requiring housing over the next couple of years. So it's really tackling both these challenges at the same time, I would say. Thank you.
I may say the challenge I see is how we leverage innovation, because if you look at in Europe, for example, the developed areas, the incentive or the way that the policy orientation have made private sector investing on energy efficiency. Now you have, business models that are really working where private sector is involved in the energy efficiency area, and they are creating business on that, right? So how we can use that in also developing areas where you have both problems, the energy production itself and then the energy efficiency. So I think the technology and the innovation has not scaled enough to really be mainstreamed on also developing areas where the need is also still present. So my two problems will be that. So first of all, investing and have scaling investments in solar, where you see in deserts. So why don't we use the solar or the geothermy in some countries, or also the dabs you have in the central area of Africa, for example. And in another way, also all the technology that is used in the world can also be quickly, I think, transferred and bring to develop also energy poverty, reduce energy poverty in those areas.
Thank you. And I think with that, we will close this session. I want to thank the panel first, of course. Adama, Puya, Carol, you've been great. You have been very generous with your experience and lessons. They've been really useful. Thanks to the audience for helping us push the panel further to get a very productive discussion, I think, out of this. And of course, thanks to any audience online as well. But with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.